He was diagnosed with mild cognitive disorder in 2016, and then he ended up in 2020. That's when it was rough. It was bad. And then slowly what was happening was, even though he was still had his strength, he would do things like he would fall. And one time, I believe this is what really set things spiraling, is he had a bad fall, and somewhere along the way, because of the fall, he got an infection.
Oh.
And that infection caused him to end up in the hospital. And when he was in the hospital, he could no longer speak. And we were there with him and seeing him where he was in a lot of pain. We couldn't get him to engage in conversation. He really wasn't interested in watching TV. And my brother made a suggestion.
My guest on this week's episode of The Beautiful Side of Grief is a very talented lady, keeping busy with all she is doing to make this world a better place. As well as being a journalist, author, and community leader, Jocelyn Jones, or Rev Jocelyn, as she is also known, is an ordained minister and the president of Faith on the Journey, a Christian counseling company specializing in grief and trauma. She is also a master facilitator with the Trauma Healing Institute and founder of the Women in Ministry, which helps women to start, grow, and sustain transformative ministries that literally change the world. Oh, and she also hosts her own podcast. This is one super inspiring lady we are meeting today. We could literally discuss anything around grief, as Jocelyn has run multiple grief groups over the years. Though what I would love to firstly delve into today with Jocelyn is her own personal and recent journey with the loss of her father to Alzheimer's, culminating in his recent passing last year. And if time permits, we can chat about the other insights Jocelyn has around the grief journey. So a very warm welcome and fabulous welcome to you, Jocelyn, for being with us on this episode today.
Well, thank you, Helen. Oh my goodness, how you just introduced me. I'm like, oh, she's so sweet. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very deserving of all of that. And I just think it sets the stage right for our conversation going ahead. So what I would love to understand is just to get a sense of who Jocelyn was growing up, what sort of home you grew up in, what you were surrounded by, and what influenced you.
Yeah, so I grew up in Hazel Crest, Illinois, which is a suburb outside of Chicago, with my mom, dad, and my younger brother, who's just 2 years younger than me. And I grew up in a loving home. My mom was stay at home, and we were involved in a whole bunch of activities. And my father, he worked really hard in corporate America, and he was a superstar to us in his own right. Outside of work, he was also known for his contribution to the martial arts. My dad was a 10th degree black belt. You didn't want to mess with him. So he was right, absolutely not in the martial arts area. But yes, my dad, even though he was very busy, he still made time to attend the important events in my life where I was performing or I had a pageant or something that was going on. He was there. And he wasn't the type that was very affectionate, but he showed his love in other ways by, again, showing up, being encouraging. And he was just someone who you knew he loved you, even if he didn't say it all the time. But I really, really loved my dad. I was, I guess you could say, a daddy's girl. And I'm getting a little bit ahead, Helen, but when I realized that something was wrong with his memory, it was very concerning to me and my family. And when he began to lose his memory, at first we were kind of like, what's going on? And I didn't realize that my mom was aware of his memory slowly declining years before my brother and I knew something was going on.
What age were you when you started noticing this?
Yes. So It was in 2016. So I was full grown adult when I was in my mid 30s when he began to lose his memory. And we just thought it was something where it's okay, maybe we can address it. He got diagnosed with mild cognitive disorder, and he was in his mid 70s by this time. And so we researched, we tried looking into different things we can do. But as time progressed, his memory continued to get worse. And here's the thing, when it comes to a condition like mild cognitive disorder or Alzheimer's, which it eventually developed into, this was something that did not happen overnight. This was traced back years, but slowly but surely, it became more evident that he is losing his memory. And when it got worse, that's when it became extremely unsettling to me when, towards the last 2 to 3 years of his life, he was no longer the super dad that I knew. It was like, wait, what's happening to dad? I'm losing him. It was a very interesting is the wrong word. It was a very difficult time because I was grieving the loss of my dad, and he was still with us because he was not the same person.
I think it's difficult in any situation to confront or face a loved one having that type of diagnosis and then seeing that develop. I think it's worse though when it is the love of your life, your daddy's girl. You have this super bond with him, and he was a high functioning superstar dad. So I can't even begin to imagine what that was like for you. We're going to unwrap that a little bit more in just a moment, but I just want to backtrack a little bit and just get an understanding. Were you already involved in grief and trauma and mentoring and helping others through that at that stage? Had you already gone on that journey?
I was newly on that journey. I had been working in the field when his Alzheimer's actually was diagnosed, maybe about a year or two. And that was something where I was doing grief work, but it wasn't from a lived experience. I can say that I had experienced loss before, but it was loss of a grandparent, which still can be very difficult. I'm not taking that
Yes.
away, or like a distant person from the church. But I never experienced loss that was this close to me. So my work in grief was a lot more theory when I was doing healing groups and ministering to people. And as I began to experience these emotions, it became different for me when I was going through my own slow loss of my dad.
So in a way, this has been a difficult but a really important foundation for you in helping others deal with their grief, because there's nothing like a lived, learned experience, is there?
It's not. It's really not. When I hear someone who's lost a parent, I now look at it very differently,
Mm,
because when you hear people go through certain experiences, you're, oh, that's really difficult. And you do empathize with them with some emotions. You feel for them. But when you've gone through it, you're like, man, I remember how I felt, and I remember what helped me. And I also remember what I didn't like people saying to me and how this affected me. And so it's different when you go through certain things, because it does, God can use it for ministry and what you're doing to serve others in a different way.
yeah. And I'm a great believer that, all our experiences, no matter how difficult or traumatic, they're all opportunities for us to learn and grow from. That's how I choose to look at all the things that have happened in my life. I have to find some way to get my head around it all. But let's go back to your dad, though, and those early days of coming to terms and understanding that cognitively he wasn't the same man that you knew. How did you cope with that? How did that affect you?
Well, I didn't at first. I
Mm.
was definitely in the denial department and I was definitely running from it. And this is the thing. Prior to my dad even getting to this point, he would always want to talk to me about when he's not here anymore. You need to consider this and prepare for this. And I would shut down the conversation. I would be like, Dad, I appreciate that. I don't want to hear it. And I would actually start crying when he would try to talk about preparing me for his death. This is before I realized his cognitive issues. So when he began to have difficulty communicating, there was one time in which this was in the middle of COVID, when COVID first started, and I couldn't go visit my family anymore. And I remember talking to my dad over the phone, and it sounded like he was drunk, even though he didn't have anything to drink. It wasn't that. It was just he was so out of it that I struggled to stay on the phone with him and had to rush off the phone because my tear ducts were just like filling up. And I'm like, oh my God, I am losing my dad. And I just broke down in tears because that was a forced reality check that I had been trying to not pay attention to, that my dad is not well and my time is running out. And I remember talking to someone about this before, and they said when it comes to something like Alzheimer's or dementia or anything that's a cognitive disorder like this, it's like a slow kiss goodbye.
Yes.
And it is grieving your loved one twice because you're watching that person that you once knew, that version of them die off, even though they're still there. And so the now part, I stayed in that land as long as I could until the reality was like, I don't know how much time I have with him, and trying to get to the point where even if he couldn't remember what we were doing like 5 or 10 minutes later, how can I create these beautiful moments? You talk about the beautiful side of grief. How can I make these moments that I can hold on to while he's still here? And that's when I began to start shifting my focus the last 2 years of his life to try to make these moments with my dad.
Did you have any regrets that you spent so long in denial about your dad and not making those memories sooner?
I did. Oh, that was huge for me. And
Mm.
partially because I am a high functioning achiever like my dad, I get it honest. And so I was constantly working, busy in ministry, doing all these things. And so I didn't prioritize like many young adults can find themselves doing, not all, but I did not prioritize spending time with family initially because I was so focused on accomplishing these goals. And so when it dawned on me, I'm running out of time. And then it was COVID. And then I was feeling like, is it safe to visit my parents? What can I do? It was like this pull. And finally I said, forget it. I'm going over there. I'll be masked up. I'll try to be safe, but I need to get this time in. But that regret was still there because I was like, man, the conversations that I wanted to have with my dad while he was fully in his right mind, I'm like, I don't know if I'll have them anymore, or just I need more time, Dad. I need more advice, and the things that we take for granted, right? When we feel like, for whatever reason, as for children, sometimes we just envision because our parents, in some cases, are a constant in our lives, we can take them for granted that they'll be there, even though we know that they're not going to always be here. Death is a reality for all of us at some point. And so, yes, to answer your question, there was a lot of regret.
So that's a big thing that often accompanies many people on their grief journey, is regret. So, what would you recommend to someone who is listening right here and now, who is experiencing that? They are thinking of all the things they could have, should have, would have done. What would
Hmm.
be your advice?
Well, the first thing is regret is one experience that we can have that it is as if we're wishing that we can change the past, and that's an impossible quest. So it's not fruitful, and it could cause us to get stuck because we can't go back and change the past. It's what has happened. And so for me, I really had to let go of that. And it's taken time. Sometimes it slips back up and I say, you know what? That's where I was at the time. And even though I did not take full advantage of certain seasons of my life of spending time with my dad, or for you, whatever individual or whatever mistake that you made, you have to release that and say, okay, I am letting go of that because at the time, that's where I was at, but I'm forgiven. I need to forgive myself and learn those moments and not make the same mistake again. And for me, and for you, you mentioned that is opportunity to learn. I said, okay, when it comes to my mom, when it comes to other people in my life, I am going to love hard and not continue to put other things before my main priorities. And so that's somewhat how I look at it. I'm like, okay, I got to learn from it. I can't change it, but I don't have to continue the same cycle of mistakes.
We can be our own worst enemies in this regard, can't we? We can be so tough and so hard on ourselves. And
Mhm.
I'm very grateful. And I don't know where this came from, but when Tal died, I just chose not to have any regrets. I made mistakes being her mama. I did things horribly wrong. I learned from them. I apologized probably hundreds of times to her for not quite getting it right. But then I thought, I don't have any regrets because she was the best and biggest ray of sunshine in my life. And that's how I wanted to remember her and have her by my side as that person. And so I guess, like you say, it is a journey and we can choose whether we want to stay in that regret or whether we choose to forgive ourselves and forgiving ourselves. Oh my gosh, that's so powerful in itself. Talk to us a
Mhm.
little bit about the power of forgiveness.
Yes, forgiveness is really release. It's releasing, it's letting go. It's for when we're forgiving others, that's what it is. It's releasing the contempt that you have and saying, releasing judgment, if you will. And sometimes that's a huge struggle in itself in terms of releasing the anger you have towards an individual for what they did wrong. But we also need to release the judgment towards ourselves. And for me, I am a Christian who, when I speak about my faith, accepting God's forgiveness for us, because I believe God knows that we are imperfect individuals and we're going to mess up sometimes. And I think for someone who is a recovering perfectionist like myself, sometimes one of the main reasons we struggle with releasing or forgiving or accepting God's forgiveness is because we have such a high standard of perfection, and perfection is just not real. It's not going to happen. And we will make mistakes, we will fall short. And so understanding that and saying, okay, I did not do that, but I'm growing and I'm going to let that go and I'm going to move forward from this and try to do better now next time. And so that's how I look at it. And it's an ongoing reminder of how we have to operate and give ourselves grace when we make mistakes and we don't get things just right.
Oh, beautiful. You hit it right there. The power of forgiveness and that perfectionism. Oh my gosh, I lived with that for most of my life. So it took
Mm,
me a good, probably more 50 years, sad to say, for
that's
me
great.
to just to let up on myself, to say it's okay. You
Mm,
don't need to be perfect anymore. You don't need to prove yourself to anybody, or you don't need to do everything perfectly. And once I allowed myself, that was like the freedom and the peace started to come into my life. And that was beautiful because
mm,
suddenly I wasn't always chasing these unrealistic high standards and bars I'd set, and just said, okay, if I get that done today, that's fantastic. Great. Good effort. If I don't, okay, tomorrow's there. So,
that's right. How
yeah.
about that?
How about that? And do you know what? When you allow yourself to do that, everybody else just flows with you. It was
They really
you
do.
that had the issue, not anybody else.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to your dad. And how long was his journey for starters? How long did you have to experience the decline of his cognition through to his eventual passing?
Yeah, so he was diagnosed with mild cognitive disorder in 2016, and then he ended up in 2020. That's when it was rough. It was bad. And then slowly what was happening was, even though he was still had his strength, he would do things like he would fall. And one time, I believe this is what really set things spiraling, is he had a bad fall, and somewhere along the way, because of the fall, he got an infection.
Oh,
And that infection caused him to end up in the hospital. And when he was in the hospital, he could no longer speak. And we were there with him and seeing him where he was in a lot of pain. We couldn't get him to engage in conversation. He really wasn't interested in watching TV. And my brother made a suggestion. He said, "Why don't we play some music for my dad?" And so we pulled out his phone and he put on my dad's favorite song that he used to play on vinyl, and he would have it on blast in the house. We played Family Reunion by the OJs. In that moment, my dad started singing in the hospital. And I almost started crying tears of joy. It was just such a beautiful moment because he was happy, like with the music. And for me, the nurses rushed in. They were like, "Mr. Jones, oh my goodness, this is so cool. Go ahead and sing." And so we had a little concert in the hospital.
oh, I love it.
And for me, I'll always cherish that memory. And again, that's the beautiful side of grief, is that
Yes.
there's certain memories that we have with our loved ones that bring us tremendous joy. And one of those ways in which we can do that is through the music, right? Music is one of the last things that someone will lose in terms of their memory. And I saw that lived out. And so for me, I'll never, ever hear that song, Family Reunion, and not think of my father and smile because of the moments. And that's the thing I had to learn, that even though my dad could not remember certain things that we were experiencing together when he really declined and eventually passed in 2022, I still had those memories that I could hold on to and create while he was still here up until the very last breath. And so that's what I hold on to when I'm missing my dad.
Oh, that is so powerful and so beautiful. And I love that. It just made me think while you were speaking. I remember, and I don't know if I've got this right or not, it's so long ago, but I remember something about the reptilian brain and rhythm, which is what music is, sound and rhythm and things like that. So maybe that's why it's one of the last things to go. What
Mm.
other beautiful memories were you able to create with your dad?
Yeah, I think just the times in which I would take him out to lunch or to dinner, or he end up paying for it, or the times in which I would just record him. When I realized that he was losing his memory, I made an attempt to record as much as possible so I could hold on to it. And so I would interview him. And this is the journalism background in me. I'm like asking all these questions and I'm recording it, whether it was on my iPhone or setting up a video. And that was really important for me because I wanted to capture the essence of my dad before his memory fully declined. Some of the footage I got, but even when it was in the latter times, I did that with him. And I also tried my best to do things that were just funny for him. I remember my dad, again, 10th degree black belt. So even right before he passed, he still remembered karate. Couldn't remember half of anything, but he remembered karate. And so I would ask him questions around karate. And I said, "Dad, show me some moves." And he's almost 82 at this point. And "Before you do some moves, I need you to drop down and give me 20 push-ups." And it was funny because I would do the push-ups and then he would lose count and tell me to start over again. And it was such a mess, but it was funny because he was laughing at me as I fell on my face, but it brought him joy and it made a memory. So I just had to find ways in which I could bond and laugh through the sadness because it was a mixed bag of emotions of laughing and then crying almost at the same
Yeah.
time of
Yeah.
accepting the reality. But I just said to myself, every second I'm going to embrace with this dear loved one of mine, which I call dad.
Can be very, very overwhelming being in that depth of sadness for such long periods of time. And so I love that you were able to find that laughter to create a balance and bring your system back to some sort of normalcy and then be able to then cope with the next episode. That's such good advice. And also recording. Wow. What a
Mm,
brilliant idea. I bet there are people who are going to listen to this episode and go, right, that is what I need to do. Even if it's not with Alzheimer's, even if it's with a chronic illness or somebody who's in a terminal diagnosis, what a brilliant time to start getting your phone out and asking all of those questions that you never thought or always assumed you would have time to ask, but never
mhm.
did. Wow. Great suggestions. Cool. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really good. So it's about living in the present with your loved one, isn't it?
It is. It forces you to do that when you think about it. It's like taking in every moment and realizing that when it comes to what my dad was going through, it was difficult for him too. And that's the thing. At some point when he was still wrestling with the fact that he was losing his memory and realizing that certain things were off, it was difficult for him to accept that reality that, wait, something is wrong with me. And then when we got to the point where we had to make difficult decisions, make sure he's not driving. And my dad was a very independent person. Those emotions that he was feeling when we're taking his independence away, he was mad. But
Absolutely.
watch we had to do what was best for him. And so my mom, God bless her, she's still living and she was the primary caretaker. And so she carried a lot of the load and a lot of the emotional burden. And bless any of the caretakers out there because it's such a difficult path. But the extended family, my brother and I, we also realize that this is challenging. And when you are caring for someone who needs that type of support and that type of care, you want to do your part to support the primary caregiver who is also experiencing a level of grief because they're slowly watching this decline, but they're also dealing with the emotional, how do I say it? Like my dad giving her the flux in this case because of his hurt and his disease
Mm.
in many cases, because it got to a point where it might not have been him struggling emotionally with letting go, but he just was not well enough because of the Alzheimer's. And so his emotions would sometimes be unregulated. And it was very difficult for my mom.
Yeah. So are you reading my mind? Because you're answering the questions I was just going to ask.
Oh, that's
I was just going to ask you, how did you need to best support your mum as the primary caregiver? What sort of things really helped her?
Yeah, we just tried to get over there as much as we could to visit because if we came to visit, she can finally get some reprieve. She can maybe go into the other room or maybe go and do some grocery shopping. And so I think showing up, first of all, is very important. I think being a listening ear so that they can vent and be raw with their venting without judgment because no one knows what it's like to be the primary caregiver. And sometimes you want to curse. Sometimes you want to be like, this drove me crazy. And you need a safe space to say all of those things and just providing that for that individual. And sometimes just offering some practical support. Okay, mom or whoever the caregiver is, let me take dad here. Let me take him out the house so you can just sleep and do
Yes.
whatever. That is very helpful. And also just making sure that you encourage the caregiver, in this case, my mom. Maybe we need to have you plug into a support group for caregivers. Okay,
Mm.
mom, what are you doing to care for yourself? Because the pressure and stress of being a caregiver can really do something to their health. And so being mindful of that as well and just checking on their well-being is important too.
They are such unsung heroes, aren't they? The
They are.
caregivers. They're the silent caregivers out there in the world who just get on with it, do what they need to, don't tend to really complain or gripe about it because what's the point often?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet we have thousands upon thousands of beautiful souls doing that job. How do you support them after they lose their loved one who has been a mainstay of their life for so very long? And in those last years, it's basically been a 24/7 role, hasn't it?
It is. It is. It is. It's an interesting transition. And again, I say interesting loosely. That's not the best word. It's like a transition for that individual that's unique for them because for some, it's a relief that they are not on 24/7 and they have all this free time that they didn't have before. But it's also tremendous grief. It's a mixed bag because the work and the requirements that you have of being on all the time is so consuming of your life. And so now it's, wait, I don't have to do this. My mom, she hardly ever got a good night's sleep when my dad was in his late stages because of the fact he would wander around the house and come in and be disturbing and everything. And so for her, it's one of those things where her sleep pattern hasn't fully recovered because of just the consistency of caring for him for so many years. So the time it takes after their death to get acclimated to now, what do I do with this time? How do I re-engage certain things that I might have stopped doing? And what's this path forward? Now I need to grieve as well after all. So it takes a lot of time and a lot of support. And I always say that I think that individuals who have been caregivers or just someone who has experienced a loss like that should find places in which you can talk about these emotions and slowly begin to unpack everything, whether that's through individual counseling, whether that's through a support group. But I don't believe that we should carry the burdens in our grief journey by ourselves. And so for me, if this is something that if you're dealing with, I encourage you to plug into some sort of community to help you to move forward as you grieve.
Because there are a lot of empty days or spaces in your day when you've gone from 24/7 caregiving to suddenly having nothing. And it's almost like too much time to think. And then if you get into the wrong thought patterns, you can start ruminating on stuff that's not very healthy for you or good for your psyches. Yeah, I totally agree. So tell me the value of grief groups,
Mm.
which you're a master in.
Oh, yes. Well, I think that grief groups can be very beneficial because it is a space to remind you that you are not by yourself in these heavy emotions, and you is a place in which to some extent people understand. Now, I say that loosely because, again, each of our grief journeys are different. So your experience with grief is not going to exactly mirror mine. However, in terms of acknowledging the pain and feeling validated to have these heavy emotions, sometimes we need that because other people who might not be familiar with the type of grief you might be going through, say, for instance, you lost a child or you lost a spouse or has some other loss that is specific in nature, if you are around others who've gone through a similar loss, is some connectivity there. And you can say, okay, if you've made it through this, how did you make it through it? And at least you get why I'm in excruciating pain right now and I can't sleep at night. So it's being around people who get you and also don't minimize your pain. One of the issues, fortunately, that I find a lot in my faith tradition in the Christian church, and it could be in other faith traditions as well, is the fact that sometimes people use Christian platitudes, Bible verses to minimize or try to make people feel better. They're really trying to encourage you with these words. And so they'll quote scriptures because they don't know what to say. And they'll say cute little sayings just because they want to fill space and they don't know what to say. But it can also make people feel worse because it
Yeah.
could feel like my pain is being minimized. And I know you're saying that God got another angel in heaven, but I want my child here or I want my spouse here. And so it can actually be hurtful for someone when they hear those things. And so in a grief group, you don't necessarily have to worry about that as much. And you have a trained facilitator who's going to organize the conversation in such a way where your feelings, your experience is validated, and you don't have to also worry about burdening other people with these heavy emotions that they might not be at a place where they can hold. People are often uncomfortable with talking about grief. And when they see someone cry, they, oh no, I don't know what to do. And so they could just say certain things or just try to change the subject or try to fix you. But grief is something that doesn't need to be fixed. Grief is a real natural emotion and needs a space to be expressed. And so the grief groups provide that for you.
Oh, everything you've just said there is so important. To have a safe space where you can be authentically you and how you need to express your grief and know that it can be validated by others and then even form friendships with
Yeah.
others because you just connect with somebody. You connect with a soul in that group who may not be on the same journey as you, but you feel that connection. You feel that they get it. They understand. Isn't that so
Yeah.
important? Yeah.
Very, very, Helen.
Are you feeling lost, anxious, unsure of how to navigate the loss of your beautiful loved one? Don't know where to head next? Yeah, I get that. Then you may be interested in the new offering I've developed, a letter of hope and aroha, to help you find out who you are right here and now and how you can navigate that without being on that emotional roller coaster, feeling out of control. That's a feeling I really disliked after Tal and then Adrian died. So I've developed an 8-week support program where each week you get an email of what worked for me, as well as other tried and true tools to help with grief. It's a beautiful, calming, healing resource that I think you're really going to like and that you can use in your everyday life to find out what works for you and what doesn't. And the great thing is, you find yourself feeling stronger and more in control so you can work out what you want life to look like going forward. So if this sounds like something you would like to check out, head over to my website or check out the link in the episode notes. You're looking for a letter of hope and aroha. Oh, yes, this is good information, Jocelyn. I know that we've talked about a lot of things about Alzheimer's, and what are some things that perhaps we haven't talked about that you feel people most need to know if they're embarking or on that journey, or if you're supporting people who are on that journey?
I would just say that dealing with anticipatory grief of this nature, where you are seeing that I don't have much time, can be very difficult. It's hard to accept. And we can find ourselves in a similar situation as me, where you try to deny the seriousness of the situation. And you don't want to find yourself experiencing that type of regret of, I should have spent more time, I should have done this. And so I just encourage you to do your best to make the most of the time you have with them. This is honestly a practice that I believe, can strive to do with everyone, regardless of if they have an illness that we love, to make the most of the time we have with them. But also realize that even if they can't remember, again, you can remember. If their memory is fading and they forget that you threw them an 80th birthday party, you'll still have the memories from the 80th birthday party that you can hold on to, the pictures, the videos, whatever you can get. And they still can experience joy. They can still experience laughter, even if the memory is fleeting. And so, for them in those moments, again, it forces you to be in the present with that individual, be in the present in a loving way, in a joyful way, do the things that make them happy, connect with them over music, because I'm telling you, music brings out the best in people in terms of those memories. And so, that's what I would encourage you to do. And then be plugged into family, because as you are journeying with someone who is losing their memory, it's difficult. And so being around loved ones who care about that individual and can lift you up and encourage you, and that you can be honest with your grief about what you're feeling in those moments, you need an outlet. And so plug into that as you are journeying forward through this process with your loved one.
What I know about a lot of caregivers is that they are exactly that. They are the givers. How do they advocate for the self-care that they need along that journey?
Oh, it's very difficult. And in each individual, their situation's different, right? Because sometimes you might not have the financial means to get part-time caregiver in. And if that's the case, maybe there might be some social service programs that you can research to try to get some additional support, because it's really difficult to do the 24-hour care and not have any break. And then the other thing is looking into family, and you might have family, but they might not be local. They might not take initiative. You might not want to ask them. And so the best advice I can give you is to do your best to try to explore resources that are available. And if you do have to be the primary caregiver and you don't really get breaks like you needed, there are support groups where you can, at least for an hour, plug in to maybe a Zoom support group or something where you can talk and vent and get it out and connect with other caregivers who are going through something similar. I've hosted caregiver support groups or meetings before, workshops, that is, for individuals, and just hearing them talk and say, man, I've gone through this, or this was so hard for me. And then, and just in some cases, just crying openly about their struggle as a caregiver was healing in nature for them. And so, in some type of way, you need an outlet to talk about what you are going through. And if you can get a breakaway, to sneak away, just have quiet time to even just sit and stare at the wall, but just not have to do that work. We need that time away. So I would explore social service agencies to see if you can get someone to support you, or you have a place where you can take your loved one for those small breaks in between.
Great advice there, Jocelyn. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, you talked about anticipatory grief. Let's talk about end of life and preparing for end of life. Did you and your family discuss with your dad what he wanted his funeral to look like?
Yeah, so he tried to discuss it with me. As I mentioned, I just was not at a place where I was ready to receive it. But my mom, they had conversations about it, and he did a good job in terms of putting things together for the state, which I'm so grateful for. If that's something that anyone who's listening right now, if you could try to facilitate some of those conversations ahead of time so it's not a hot mess, because grief is hard already. But when you got a disaster with the estate, that makes it worse. And it worked out for me. But if I could go back in time, I would try to be more open to engaging in some of the conversations around life after his death, because it's such a difficult conversation to have, but it's also an important conversation to have. And you can't ask the person to come back from the grave afterwards and say, but what about this or what about that? You can't do that. And so, even though you might start crying, even though it's uncomfortable, even though you do not want to talk about it, quite frankly, it is something that we do need to talk about, because the flip side of this is, if in my case, if my parents weren't ahead of the game in terms of estate planning and things were in disarray, it would have been a hot mess for us. And so maybe it's something where you do need to initiate certain conversations, as difficult as they are.
This is what I love about what we're both doing with the shows that we're doing is that we're highlighting these things that are typically not really talked about a lot in society. And oh, yeah, we can deal with that another day. We've got a long time before that
Mhm.
happens. But actually, we absolutely do not know what is around the corner for us.
That's
And
right.
so the earlier we can have these types of conversations and accept that they are healthy conversations, the better. Because let's just deal with the fact that we may not have tomorrow.
That's right.
Yeah, we've got here and we've got now. Let's make the most of it. That just came to mind as you were talking about that, about how important those conversations are. And I came across a couple of beautiful ladies that developed a card game called the Death Deck. And it's, yes, you can have parties around this and you can deal out, you can do it in a number of different ways, but you can deal out the cards and they all have really pivotal questions for
Mm.
people to consider. Do you want a celebration of death or do you want a celebration of life?
Hmm.
Yeah. And do you want that to happen
Mm.
before? If you
Mhm.
know that somebody has got an illness, do you want that to happen before? So you get all the people that you
Right.
want around you, and you have this great party where you get to share memories and talk about the good times and do all that sort of stuff before.
Mm.
It's that sort of conversation that can
Right.
happen. And it's just beautiful because it just makes you think and consider what is it that you would really like.
I love that.
Jocelyn, we're not going to get to talk about grief and trauma, and perhaps that's an opportunity we can do down the line because I also think trauma and grief is very much wrapped in together and a very
Mhm.
big topic for us to be sharing. But I want to let you know how grateful I am for what you've shared today around your own experiences with your dad and with your mom and with your family and how you've been dealing with that journey you've had on Alzheimer's. There are a few questions I finish off every episode with. And these are the first one is, what is the best thing that has happened to you so far today?
Mm. The best thing that's happened. Wow, that's a good question. I would just say that I woke up next to my husband and we are in such a loving place right now in spite of the storms that we've gone through. And I said, God, thank you for allowing me to see another day with someone who I love. I think that would probably be the highlight of the day.
Oh, that's pretty beautiful. What a beautiful way to start your day off. Oh,
Right.
yeah. And we're talking about gratitude now. What is something that you are most grateful for?
Hmm. I'm grateful for the lessons that I've learned from the mistakes that I've made. I have, for the longest, again, recovering perfectionist, have really struggled with condemnation because of the mistakes and failures. But I'm really learning to say, it's okay, sis. God has used these mistakes that you've made to do tremendous work to actually start your ministry. It makes you authentic and be able to connect with people. So, no, it's okay. It is okay. And so I've grown tremendously from the failures and missteps that I've made along the way. And so I'm grateful for how I've been able to move forward in spite of those things.
I love that answer because that shows vulnerability. Yes, recovering perfectionists, we always find those things a little bit tricky, don't we?
We do. We do.
Being kind to ourselves. When you have moments in your day that turn to custard when they are not going so well, how do you pivot out of those moments?
I have learned that we don't have to wait until the new year to hit the reset button. Every hour, every second, sometimes we can choose to reset. And so when I find myself going there, because I can spiral. I can get in my head. I'm an introvert, and I can start thinking about these negative thoughts and what I should have, could have did, and what went wrong. I have learned how to snap myself out of that and say, okay, is this serving me to think this way? Can I change it? Let me hit the reset button. This is a new hour. This is a new moment. And I don't have to let what just happened ruin the rest of my day.
Yeah.
That's a choice. For me to let this cause me to unravel just because this person acted the fool or this mistake happened or whatever the case may be. And so I'm choosing to reset this now and have this outlook for the rest of the day.
Oh, that is great advice. Love that. So I'm going to have all the links of how people can reach you, plus your bio in the episode notes. Would you like to just share how they can reach you? What's the easiest way to reach you just now? And also any parting comments you may have for us.
Sure. I think the catch-all website to go to is my website, jocelynjjones.com. And you'll learn about books and resources and speaking and the things I do on my podcast as well. And so I would say check that out right there. And the other thing I would just mention is whatever you might struggle with, this might be a season of grief for you. It could be a season where you're just going through a challenging time. Whatever is going on in your life, just remember that we're not meant to do life alone. Even as an introvert who likes to spend time alone, I have found that I still need people. I still need community, and I still need to have safe places that I can go to be honest, where I don't have to be Reverend Jocelyn. You don't have to be whatever your title is. You can just be. We are human beings, not human doers. And so when it comes to healing, when it comes to grieving, when it comes to caring for ourselves, sometimes we have to stop the doing and just be in authentic places where we can be honest about what we're struggling with. So find that place wherever that might be.
It's beautiful. Why is it that introverted perfectionists always are out there doing so much?
There's a trend there. I think
Have
we're
you
onto
thought
something.
of
Overperformance.
I
What's
know.
going on?
Oh my gosh, especially when we just crave our own space and love being in our own space. Like I often have thought about that. Oh, now something I also remembered, you have a free grief resource that people can access as well, don't you?
Thank you for asking. Yes, I do have a free grief resource guide that anyone who is interested in. It's like a grief survival kit. It offers you some resources to help you to navigate what you're going through. So I'll make sure that you have that available in the link as well, the show links, so that you can download that for free.
Oh, that would be perfect. Ah, Rev Jocelyn, what an absolute privilege and honor it has been to connect with you today, to have you share so openly your own heart about your own grief. And I think that's going to serve our listeners so very well. And truly, there are so many gems in what we've talked about today. And I am very grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Helen.
Thanks for listening. I hope you got some real value from this episode. If there's a topic you'd like covered, click on the Beautiful Side of Grief at gmail.com link or go into the beautifulsideofgrief.com website where you can also leave a review. To get notified of new episodes, hit the subscribe button. And if you know of somebody who could benefit from this episode, please share. And until next time, please be kind to you and take good care.